She bought the sun-baked hillside on a dare to herself, the kind of land old-timers called worthless, too rocky for corn, too dry for anything but scrub and regret. The deed was barely dry when the jokes began. At the co-op, men in dusty caps watched her unload spindly grapevines and laughed into their coffee. "Grapes? On that hill? Honey, you'll grow more blisters than fruit," one called, tipping his hat with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. She planted anyway, knees in the gravel, hands raw from prying stones free, each young vine a quiet act of defiance. Neighbors slowed their trucks to stare, some offering advice she hadn't asked for, most offering only pity. The wind scoured the slope and the sun hammered down, yet she kept working, staking every row as if the land itself might one day believe her. In that first hard light she already saw what no one else could: green leaves against bare rock, and a harvest that would silence every doubt. It didn't take long for her grapevines to become the most talked-about sight in the valley. At every stop, the feed store, the Sunday breakfast buffet, even the post office, someone felt the need to caution her with a story. Mrs. Howe reminded her that the bakers tried table grapes back in '89 and watched the roots wither before July. Old Roy claimed, loudly, that even the Italian immigrant families who once settled these hills had to give up and plant orchard grass instead. "It's just the way things are here. These hills don't take kindly to new ideas," he declared, as if history itself was another neighbor waiting to scold her. Cousins came to visit and walk the slope, shaking their heads, counting the stones. Her uncle offered a bet. "A case of soda says you'll haul those vines out before next Christmas, roots and all." Others passed along advice with a mixture of kindness and condescension. Build windbreaks, try another crop, wait for a wet year. Some even left warnings tacked to her fence in notes. "Save your money, stick to hay." The weight of other people's certainty pressed in from all sides, tightening with every retold failure and every memory of what didn't work. Yet in every doubtful voice she heard the same thing: a quiet fear of being wrong, of believing there was something more in this land than anyone else dared to imagine. So she pressed on, letting their doubts burn as steady as the sun, a reminder to hope harder and hang on just a little longer. The first summer arrived with a vengeance. Drought settled over the hilltop and never seemed to lift. Every week, another cloudless forecast on the radio. She fed what little water she could spare to the vines, hauling buckets uphill from a slow, silty creek until her arms ached. More days than she liked to admit, the ground cracked underfoot, dust swirling at every step, and new leaves curled like fists against the heat. The stones she'd pried loose from the soil only seemed to multiply, rising up after every rainless night, their pale shapes littering the earth like stubborn reminders of every doubter's warning. Rabbits and deer, desperate in the dry spell, found the weak spots in her wire and chewed young shoots to stubs before dawn. More than once she chased a flock of wild turkeys out from between the rows, her voice lost in the wind, while the rest of the valley quietly took inventory of her losses. By midsummer, half the vines looked more ghost than promise, stems shriveled and brown, hope drying out with every passing week. Alone and exhausted, she walked the slope at dusk, counting failures and biting back the temptation to listen to all the voices that said, "I told you so." She wondered if maybe some soil just refused to change, no matter how much you believed. Still, as another sun set fiery red behind the ridge, she couldn't give up, not yet. Some part of her still saw fruit hiding in the stony gloom, waiting for the harvest no one else expected. That autumn she changed her approach, not by doubling down on brute effort, but by learning the rhythm of her land. At daybreak she knelt to sift the dirt, noticing how sun-baked topsoil hid pockets of moisture beneath the rocks. She listened to the wind as it traced the ridge, watching where fog lingered in cooler pockets at dawn. When she met old Mrs. DeLuca in the church kitchen, she brewed coffee and listened to tales of vineyards in drier, steeper places across the world. "Plant close, let the roots fight," Mrs. DeLuca advised, remembering her father's stubborn tendrils clawing through gravel in Sicily. The words echoed as she experimented with tighter planting and mulch from last year's hay, hoping to stretch shade and conserve dew. She researched drought-resistant rootstocks and begged cuttings from a distant cousin who'd coaxed grapes in sandy soils. Instead of fighting every rock, she stacked them along the upper rows, letting them reflect heat at night and mark windbreaks. When winter set in, she built a clumsy network of rain barrels and gutters to catch every drop the skies allowed. Little by little, shoots rose and leaves unfurled. Tougher this time, deep green instead of yellow, roots digging down past the stones. The progress was subtle, invisible to most. A few neighbors passing by still muttered about waste, shaking heads at her makeshift trellises and patchwork drip lines. Yet in the silence between their doubts, she recognized gentle changes. A single vine pushing through the worst of the gravel, the sound of bees finding shelter among blooming cover crops she'd sown just for luck, a crescent of healthy leaves silhouetted by the evening sun. It wasn't enough to win hearts, but it was enough for her to press on, carrying the tiniest proof that impossible land was only waiting for someone willing to listen. Spring returned with promise, but hope didn't last. Just as green tips began to brighten the rose, an unexpected frost swept in on a clear night and withered half the vines she'd spent months coaxing to life. She walked the slope at dawn, breath trailing in the cold as she counted wilted leaves, her heart sinking with every brittle stem. Then came the deer, drawn by hunger and the sweet scent of growth, crashing through her fences when she slept, and stripping tender shoots in a single night. Defeat pressed heavy, each loss stacked atop old doubts and endless work. She sat alone beneath the one surviving vine near her porch, thumb tracing the chipped rim of her mother's old teacup, an heirloom carried from a farm that had once seemed just as hopeless. The urge to quit pulled hard, every muscle sore, her eyes stinging with tiredness and old injury. She almost phoned the realtor, almost let herself imagine an easier life somewhere flat and familiar. But just then, a letter arrived from Mrs. DeLuca, sharing a weathered photograph of the first grape cluster her own father ever picked. Small, misshapen, but a victory over stone and wind. "Remember," she wrote, "roots find a way if you give them time." Tears mingled with determination. She stood, shoulders squared, and walked the rows again, telling herself that somewhere beneath disappointment, life was still pushing up. One more lesson, one more year. With another year, the lessons finally took root alongside the vines. She watered at sunrise and dusk, letting droplets trickle slowly at each stem's base so the earth had a chance to drink before noon's heat. The mulch she'd piled thick, layers of hay, stone dust, and leaf mold, now held in the coolness, saving every precious drop. As spring unfolded, the hillside stayed greener longer than ever before. She adjusted wire supports so the vines hugged the earth, protected from wind and frost, and walked the rows every day, checking for the smallest sign of hope. This time, instead of dying back or breaking, new shoots pushed through, quick and determined. Pale leaves unfurled, shy at first, then bold, reaching for sun, trailing over rocks she'd come to see as allies instead of obstacles. Soon there were clusters of tiny blossoms, and then clusters of fruit, tentative but real. One morning she heard gravel crunch by the road. Neighbors whose predictably skeptical glances had marked every previous year now slowed their trucks, not to gawk, but to look, really look, at the lines of green winding through stone. Word traveled fast. A farmer from across the ridge stopped to ask about her rain barrels. Even the feed store clerk, once quick to laugh at her plans, drove out to see for himself, walking the fence line in near silence. The impossible crop had survived another summer and seemed, against logic, to promise more. By late July, the first grapes swelled, deepening from pale yellow to dusty rose. The town buzzed with a different kind of rumor. Maybe, just maybe, something unexpected was blooming at last on the hillside they'd all given up on. She smiled, feeling gratitude and a trace of vindication, her work finally catching the breeze. That autumn, her vineyard was a mosaic of hope and imperfection. Some vines sagged, tangled in wild directions, and bare patches dotted the slope where nothing had survived. But there in the middle, heavy clusters of grapes shimmered in the low golden light, pale green, sun-warmed red, and the darkest blue-black, each fruit a miracle against the odds. She picked carefully, filling baskets with more sweetness than she'd dared to imagine, juice running sticky down her arms, the scent of promise everywhere. News spread far beyond the valley. The local weekly stopped by, snapping photos of the grapes piled high on her old wooden table. Their headline read, "Impossible Harvest on Rocky Hill." Neighbors who'd only ever passed at a distance now climbed out of their trucks to walk the rows in awe, children darting through the vines, laughter echoing over the stones. Even the skeptics who'd joked at her expense lined up to taste, their expressions softening with surprise at the sharp, sun-born flavor bursting from the fruit. She shared her harvest with everyone, those who'd offered advice and those who'd only watched, generous with samples and recipes, as delighted by their wonder as by her own payoff. Together, the town celebrated not just the grapes, but the lesson growing alongside them. That there are seasons in every place and person no expert can predict, and sometimes joy hides in the very ground we've called hopeless. The first harvest, full of color and gratitude, was far from the end, but it was enough to change everything and remind the valley that miracles can grow where no one expects to see them. By the following spring, hope was contagious. Up and down the valley, neighbors began planting their own impossible rows. Berries along fence lines, figs on stony knolls, sunflowers circling lonely barns. Skepticism gave way to quiet experiments, and where laughter had once greeted her every effort, now encouragement and curiosity took root. The once overlooked hillside became a landmark, drawing visitors and sparking conversations about what else might thrive in this impractical land. The town itself seemed brushed with new color and confidence, all because she'd refused to yield to doubt and tradition. Her story rippled outward as a living lesson. Never let someone else's history set the limits of your harvest. What dreams are you willing to plant, even where others say it can't be done?